Marinations is a nutritious stew of nature, culture, and ideas. Tonight we interview Fran Quittel about her struggles to achieve justice for depositors at IndyMac Bank. Welcome to Marinations. In this segment we have Fran Quittel, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how she was able to respond to a banking crisis that hit her at home, and how she was able to bring things around to win a major victory in this battle. Fran, nice to have you here. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was that precipitated, what the crisis was that brought all this on?
I want to start out by saying the result.
Okay.
I and a very small group of depositors got back $270 million in deposits for 9,500 depositors. And it took us 2 years. This was the amount that the FDIC had debited from bank accounts in 2008 in the banks that they took over. And the one primary bank was IndyMac Bank, which was taken over, I believe it was July 11th, 2008. And that's what started the whole thing. That's what started my campaign.
So if I understand it, the amount that they took was amounts that were uninsured.
That's correct.
At the time. And some of the people who had the money in there thought at the time were under the misunderstanding that they were insured.
What happened at the time was that FDIC insurance was $100,000 per depositor, per tax ID, really per account. And there were people who had multiple accounts at IndyMac Bank or trust accounts who either thought that the accounts were insured separately, or else they had the idea that the beneficiaries in their trust accounts or their joint accounts gave them more than $100,000 worth of insurance per depositor, per account. And that turned out to be erroneous thinking. And on the day of the takeover, what the FDIC did was debit 50% of the amount over their calculation, so that if you had $200,000 in your account, what you got back per the FDIC was $100,000 insured and half of the next $100,000. So $50,000 just disappeared to we don't know where.
And so how did you find out about this? I understand that it was a shock to you that this takeover was even happening.
I was stupefied. Actually, I found out afterwards that Senator Schumer had been blowing the whistle on this bank for quite a few weeks. But I was in my car. It was about 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and I was just thinking, I have a tax return that needs to be finished so I can fund my pension contribution. And all of a sudden, I didn't have that to worry about. The FDIC closed IndyMac Bank, took it over, and the money that I thought I had set aside for my pension in my business account all of a sudden was debited by half.
So when this happened, how did you feel about all this? I mean, how did you feel?
I was amazed. I went home, I went to bed, I stayed in bed for a week. I dragged around, and I thought, I just started watching television. I saw 10,000 people lining up in front of that bank, and I thought, it's one thing if I made this mistake, but me and 9,999 other people to have made the same mistake, this is ridiculous. So on about the 8th day or the 9th day, I got out of bed and I decided I would start working on the content for a website. And a girlfriend called me up and she said, nobody has seen you for a week. Pull yourself together and get dressed. She said, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What do you have on? I said, my nightgown. And she said, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to put up a website. I'm going to see if I can do something about this. And that's what started the whole thing.
Now, you have some background in using this kind of technology, and so I understand that when you put up the website, one of the concerns you had was to reach out to other people who were also here and to kind of to bring this issue out. And so you did some things like, for example, I understand you put meta tags in your code so that when it was found by search engines and people searched, they'd be able to find your site.
I didn't put the meta tags in. I packed the site with, and I use that term deliberately, I packed the site with keywords. I knew people would go online and they would start searching to find out more information about IndyMac Bank and the FDIC and takeovers and lost deposits. And so I put those words into the copy for the site, and the web designer for that first site, which was called FDIC Business Alerts, which no longer exists, but he was able to tag the site so that it would be found. I also was contacted by journalists from Market Watch and from the Chronicle, and they came over and they started interviewing me and writing about me. And then once the site went up, about 200 people got in touch with me. And some of those stories were just horrific. They were people who were responsible for their parents' money. One woman had sold her mother's house, and the week before put the money from the sale of the house into an account at IndyMac Bank, and IndyMac had assured her that the money was safe. And she called me up and told me she was going to commit suicide because she had lost her mother's money. I had old people with trust accounts calling me up, screaming and shouting, and I thought to myself, this is really wrong.
Now, I understand also that someone had put their payroll money into an account that was snatched away.
When this happened, it was the Friday before mid-month payroll, and there was a drayage company in Southern California where they were funding their payroll. And just at that moment in time, the money had been put into an IndyMac account so that payroll could be run. But when this happened at 5 o'clock or 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, 50% of the money over the $100,000 was deducted from that account, so the company didn't have enough money to meet the payroll needs of its employees.
And that was 2008.
Right.
Okay, so now we have this website up. These people have interviewed you. I looked on the web and found that there were people who went down to the bank in shock and awe and horror, trying to get their money out and lining up and so on and so forth, not understanding what happened. So there was a tremendous amount of concern. This is almost maybe the second biggest failure at the time, I think.
Right. And what happened, in other accounts, the accounts were kept whole. IndyMac was this unique set of circumstances that when the FDIC took over, they had this 50% going on, whereas Wachovia, Washington Mutual, other banks were kept entirely whole. And people were saying, why is this happening? And then, of course, the limit was lifted from 100,000 to 250,000, and people said, this is happening in the same time frame, within the same 90 days, so why isn't the $250,000 limit applicable to us? And what the FDIC told us, especially where there were trust accounts with errors in the paperwork regarding beneficiaries, the FDIC had the temerity to tell depositors that they were responsible for errors in the bank's paperwork, that the depositors themselves were responsible, and that the depositors needed to be more careful. So this was the great scenario as we first got into this. And I want to explain something else. When I put up that first website and 200 people got in touch with me, a few of those people, including a gal in Southern California whose name is Lisa Marshall, she began working with me with the same passion that I had, and a few other people came, a core group of maybe 5 or 6 people, and we didn't even meet each other except once or twice in the entire 2 years, but we worked together as a core group for 2 years in order to get the result that we wanted.
Now, I understand a fellow named Lars actually put together Google groups so that people could exchange information. That was one of the first things that happened after your website?
Google actually turned out to be really important in what we were doing. The first thing was we put up Lars put up a Google group. I think it was Lars Chapsky. And then another person, Lisa, put up the website. And then I had a number of Google alerts based on certain keywords. And what that meant was every day at a certain time of the day, I would get news feeds about the FDIC or the Mnuchin family. Steve Mnuchin, who was the son of a Goldman Sachs mogul, and in fact, he himself was a ex-Goldman Sachs mogul. So we had these...
And he was one of the people who was
bought
in
the bank.
The takeover.
Right. And the other Google alert was on One West. So every day, when I would get these news feeds, whatever was really important I would take and I would then publicize through the Google group.
So you had the Google group. There was a number of other techniques that were used by your group. Basically, you became sort of a hodgepodge of depositors here.
When the Wall Street Journal interviewed us at the very end, when we got the money back, they called us a hodgepodge. They couldn't believe that a hodgepodge group of depositors has been responsible for this amazing result.
So basically what happened is you started forming and you became this sort of semi-loose and unorganized but cohesive group. You used Google Alerts. I understand also that you have a background in public relations, and some of the people who joined also did. And so you were also staying in touch with these journalists and feeding them back information, answering some of the stuff that came out.
So I want to emphasize that at the beginning, I met an FDIC ombudsman whose name was Rich Schmalzer. And I met him here in San Francisco thanks to Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And he told me that in order to get the money back, he laughed at me actually, and he said we would need an act of Congress. And I couldn't believe this. He literally laughed me out of his office and trivialized me and made me feel like, oh, this is really impossible. But then, as in the 2 years, as information began to come out about the FDIC and One West and the Mnuchin family and Goldman Sachs and John Paulson, every time the FDIC put out a news release, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, I would put out a news release also. I would write the news release, Lisa and I would work on the news release, and then we had another gal in our group who owned a PR firm. Her name was Agnes Huff. And Agnes Huff had the distribution mechanism. So every time the FDIC or One West or John Paulson put out a news release about what was going on, we put one out also. And we began to capture the attention of certain journalists. Some of the journalists were people in Southern California who were covering what was going on at IndyMac Bank, at One West. Other people were covering the FDIC. There were reporters from the Wall Street Journal who had the FDIC in Washington, who had the FDIC as their beat. Mm-hmm. There were other reporters from the Journal who had consumer banking as some of, and of course the concern about this over the 2 years was enormous. So we just began, and I began in particular, that you might say that was my job, packaging the story so in sound bites so mm-hmm. that journalists could easily get the information that we had.
So this kept your issue in sort of in the public eye. Now at the same time, you were concerned with depositors specifically, but at the same time, just to put it in context, in the country there was a huge number of people whose homes were being foreclosed who were concerned about all of this. There was a concern that was developing that the FDIC may not have done a good job of alerting people to these issues when they first came up. So there was a whole lot of other groundswell building at the time, and you folks stayed in touch with that as well. We won't cover too much of that here today, but I wanted to talk about some of the other things that you folks did in terms of working together. I understand that you did have some conference calls among your group where you used some of the free conferencing that's available over the web.
We had a couple of conference calls. Those weren't, over the 2 years, maybe we had 2 conference calls. We tried to develop a consensus of what needed to be done. And as this groundswell of information began coming out, we would pound members of Congress. We had a few conference calls where we just decided we were going to start calling either Nancy Pelosi's office or Barney Frank's office or Senator Schumer's office or Chuck Grassley's office, and we would all of us and our families and our friends, we would get everyone to just be on the phone, send emails, call these members of Congress, and we would just decide that this was our next action step.
Great. So one of the things that I understand your group did also was you built, you kept track of 2 things. You kept track using Justia and other things. You looked at the various kinds of lawsuits that were going on to try to track and see what kind of information became available in the public domain. Things like depositions, things like lawsuits that were being filed, and you were looking at how other people filed those lawsuits. So you're building this sort of base of this information. At the same time, you had people who were building a database of people who were affected and what congressional districts they were in. So you kind of knew a little bit, and I understand from a third point of view, you were looking to see who was getting contributions from the big guys, so you kind of knew when you're talking to Congress people or senators or whatever, a little bit more about the background of what was going on.
So I want to emphasize that many of us who were putting together this grassroots effort were women, and we were also entrepreneurs. And so what happened was each of us had a separate skill, and we just jumped in and we used that skill. We weren't particularly trained in getting back $270 million. Nobody was really a lawyer. But we just decided if we needed research, all this stuff was on the web and we could somehow get it. So when a depositor filed a lawsuit, the FDIC was then deposed. And we found out about the lawsuits because they were listed in this Justia database. Mm-hmm. And then we'd find out who the depositors were who were suing. And we'd call them up and we'd say, do you have any depositions? The depositions were being made public anyway. It was public information. And these depositions were shared with us. And what happened was one gal put together, her husband put together a huge database. We broke the list of depositors down by the congressional district they were in, what kind of account they had, how much money they had lost. We had the depositions. We knew who was filing lawsuits. And this was another key, we shared a huge amount of information because of the web. But a lot of this was done just with the telephone. There were people who were older people who formed part of our group, and they went on the web maybe once a week. But meanwhile, there had been this groundswell of activity of those of us who were on the web 10 times a day, making 10 phone calls a day. Mm-hmm. But the sharing of information and the sharing of information via the web was really what made this happen.
Right, so it sounds like that the web was able to provide a tool to focus the group and bring a certain level of cohesion, even though the basic ground rules for the hodgepodge group were focused on individual initiative was a key part here, and so it was a democratic a response to a democratic problem in a kind of a unique way that we don't see enough of these days.
I want to tell you, Bruce, one of the most amazing things, we had lawyers who were going to be paid 1/3 of the recovery fee, lawyers of depositors who had filed suits, and those lawyers were in touch with us, and they had no result from their suits. And we, on the other hand, got back the $270 million because we did get not an act of Congress, but an amendment attached to the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill, and that was what restored the $270 million.
I want to come back to that in just a minute. I understand some of the other things that you did were that you had some ability to get a hold of some of these Congresspeople's staff.
Right.
So through this course of developing the social network, you had some people join who had these contacts and were able to get you in to talk, or not just you personally, but your group were able to get in and get this issue in front of Jane Harman, for example?
Jane Harman and David Dreyer were both representatives in Southern California, and Jane Harman was fearless. We had gone to Barney Frank, and he had flatly turned us down, as though he didn't even respond in a cogent way to the correspondence that we wrote to him. But one of the members of our group knew the chief of staff of Jane Harman's office, and he took his binder and he showed it to this chief of staff. And Lisa Marshall also took a group of depositors to Jane Harman's office and just sat there. We got her attention through sheer persistence, and she paid attention to what happened to the depositors. She understood that what she said was that the depositors were the victims of what happened, not the cause, not the creation. And she really went to bat. She is a miracle worker. She went to bat for us.
It was quite amazing what she did, and I think that illustrates another point here, and that is that when this fellow went to her office with the binder, you had a lot of information, very well organized. So it was relatively easy for her staff to understand what was going on and to make sure that they had all the information they needed to analyze whether or not your group was credible and to understand what the impact was on their constituents.
First of all, in the 2 years after, one of the most amazing things that happened was that the FDIC and the OTS, the Office of Thrift Supervision, produced audits, and they again were information that became part of the public domain. And when you read these audits, and they were specifically geared to what happened at IndyMac Bank, your mouth would have dropped open. It was eye-popping material. that the FDIC and the OTS, knowing all along that that bank was in trouble, still allowed the bank to keep on making these ninja loans. No income, no jobs, no assets. That was one. The second thing was that the FDIC allowed the bank to backdate a capital infusion from May 2008 to March of 2008. In other words, this happened on the FDIC's watch. And in these two reports, pages and pages, the FDIC said it didn't have enough people to supervise the bank properly, that the people were new, they were not well trained, that, I mean, it was one excuse after another.
So basically what was happening here, if I understood it correctly, is the FDIC had applied one standard to the banks and the regulations approach, and a different standard to these individual small depositors in terms of these deadlines and warning people and that sort of a thing. There was some warning that happened about this failure overall, and the remedy that you all came up with was basically to set the date for the change in the $100,000 to $250,000 coverage, so the coverage went up, so that it covered people from January of 2008
right,
all the way up through the time. So when they took over the bank in May and then later set this new standard arbitrarily when everybody realized there was a problem in the summer, basically that's what left you folks uncovered in all these 9,000 people. And so that what ended up happening with the Schumer, the bill in the Senate was it actually set that coverage so that it happened.
It made it retroactive. One of the most important things about the solution, we realized this as we went along, well, the FDIC wasn't going to say we failed to supervise the bank.
Of course not.
Absolutely. So there needed to be a solution that was without blame, without guilt.
Yes.
And we began pressing. We ourselves understood that if we started pounding our chest saying, look, FDIC, you've really done something bad to depositors, that would never work. So a blame-free solution was just to roll back the lift in FDIC insurance back to cover every bank that was taken over in 2008. And the FDIC itself, first of all, they began to understand we were not going away. That was one. And they needed to come up with a solution, and a solution that was blame-free. And this solved everything for everyone but 500 depositors. And the reason I say that is there were 500 depositors, like there were trust funds that were bigger than $250,000 that
Sure.
were not going to get any additional money back.
You can't always fix
Right.
everything, but you're able to fix for 9,000 people.
9,500
people, and over $200 million was returned. And what also happened was you had to align this change with the groundswell that was happening in the country, because the bill that finally made this correction was a huge bill
Right.
that changed banking regulation overall. So if you hadn't been at the right time with the right solution, this probably wouldn't have happened.
When originally when we went to Barney Frank, he told us no. And he didn't really answer us. But then the mood of the country began to change. And it changed in part because of everything that happened with Goldman Sachs and John Paulson, and also the fact that One West, as it owned IndyMac, in its first year made a profit. I think the value of its stock went up by $1.6 billion. So when Jane Harman went back to Barney Frank, she said, listen, Barney, you can't have these billionaires making $1.6 billion and depositors who've put their life savings in these banks, you can't have deposited out by $270 million. So the logic began to change.
Well, that was very significant. I understand that also your group used some events to bring additional media focus to this area. You had some people that went out and did a little demonstration.
We had a few demonstrations actually, but we decided at the first anniversary of the bank takeover, we decided that we'd have an anniversary party. And our anniversary party consisted of going, I think, to Office Max or Office Depot and getting big pieces of cardboard and magic markers, and we rounded up elderly people, depositors, and people with babies, and we went and just marched in front of the FDIC headquarters in Irvine, and we told all of the television networks in Southern California that we were going to do this, and they actually covered us. There might have been 50 of us out there marching away.
So that was just one of the techniques you used, and basically what happened is, as I understand it, it was this year finally that things finally got turned around, and there was a bill. Jane Harman's bill was approved by the House.
Amendment.
It was an amendment, actually, yes. And then that was referred to committee, and then that all fed into the Senate, and then that resolution process, this became part of the Dodd-Frank bill that was actually signed in July of this year.
It was the most amazing thing that with a stroke of the pen, 9,500 depositors got back $270 million with no legal fees, right? And there we were, a group of 6 people, let's say, who had started this grassroots effort and just stuck together using the web to communicate, using the web for our research, using the telephone to call senators and congressmen. With one stroke of the pen, 9,500 depositors got back $270 million. We were stupefied.
Well, Fran, I want to thank you very much for sharing that story with us. This has been really fun, and it's certainly it's something that our viewers will understand is something they can do if they use some of these techniques and get together. It shows that there is still room for people to take action and to organize themselves, and not just to simply be the little cork bobbing on the sea of events as all of these huge economic changes slosh back and forth. And I want to thank you for sharing that story with us and for your action in helping this to
It's my pleasure. And I hope, the only thing I can say is I hope more people decide to sit down and do something about things, even if they're big things. When we got together, in essence, Lisa and I said to each other, you know, the right 2 people lost their money because if it hadn't been us, the depositors wouldn't have gotten their money back. And we had we didn't make any money from this, but we had the most enormous gratification for making things better for every depositor in the country.
Well, thank you, Fran, and thank you. This has been Marinations, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.